Growing up, one of my favorite boxers was Sugar Ray Leonard. My parents even bought me Sugar Ray Leonard boxing gloves and a punching bag for Christmas. Leonard fought Roberto Duran for the first time in June of 1980. The brawl in Montreal ended with Duran knocking Leonard all across the ring to net a unanimous decision. Leonard fought flat-footed in response to his critics who said he could only dance and play around in the ring. So when the two fighters had a rematch in November of that same year in New Orleans, Leonard got his revenge using what he knows best, dancing. Leonard outmoved Duran so badly that Duran quit out of embarrassment in round 8, shocking the entire world with 2 words, no mas. When others have caused us to be in the situation we are in, how do we respond? Do we seek revenge? Do we plot to get even? Joseph had a chance to get even with his brothers after life had knocked him down. And in today's conclusion to our series, Get Up, we see how Joseph responded when he finally had the upper hand. Awesome, man. I've enjoyed this series and talking to you about the life of one of my favorite characters in the Bible, Joseph. At the end of our story last week, we find Joseph had been put in charge of all Pharaoh's affairs, and the events of Pharaoh's dream were beginning to unfold. There had been 7 good years. I mean, talking bumper crops, amazing years, and Joseph had taken a portion of all those crops from everyone to hold back for the 7 bad years that were coming. Then the famine struck, just as Joseph had predicted from Pharaoh's dream, and people began to come to Joseph to buy grain, and that's where we pick up the story today. Genesis chapter 42, verse 1, when Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive, otherwise we'll die." So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain, but Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with him for fear some harm might come to him. So Jacob's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. And since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that the brothers came. When they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him, and he remembered the dreams he had about them many years before. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become." There's several things throughout this story this morning that I want you to see. And it's when you have the upper hand, the first thing I want you to see is that you need to remember God's plan. Look at verse 9 again. And he remembered the dreams he had had about them many years before. I don't know if Joseph, at this point in his life, was looking for his brothers to show up, like just waiting on them, or if he expected maybe they might come. I don't know if he expected that he was really at this part of the plan where they were going to come and they were going to bow down for him. I don't know about that, but it was at the moment that he recognized his brothers that he remembered the dream. He remembered the dream. And at that moment, God's dream became God's plan. Joseph remembered the dream. He remembered God's plan. And when we finally are in a position to have the upper hand, we need to remember that all the trials, all the stuff that we've walked through are leading us to this moment. It's all it was part of God's plan. It may not look, it may not look or feel like God's plan. The pit didn't look like God's plan. The prison didn't look like God's plan. Being accused at Potiphar's house didn't look like God's plan. But it was all a part of God's plan, leading these brothers to Joseph at this moment to bow down before him so that he could save a nation. You may feel like it's your plan when you're successful. When you've got the upper hand, you're starting to succeed. Man, this is my plan. I got myself into this situation. You know, it's God's fault that I was in the bad situation, but I got myself out of this. You need to remember, it's God's plan. Proverbs 16:1, we can make our own plans, but the Lord gives us the right answer. People may be pure in their own eyes, but the Lord examines motives. Commit your actions to the Lord and your plans will succeed. The Lord has made everything, get this, for his own purposes, even the wicked for a day of disaster. It's God's plan. So Joseph knew that he was in the middle of God's plan at this time. He knew that he was there to save his family. So he does what any brother who's been thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by his older brothers would do. He threw them in prison for 3 days. Now, what was the point of that? Honestly, I'm sitting here thinking about this. How do I preach this? How do I tell the people, hey, when you finally got the upper hand, throw them in prison for 3 days? Y'all are going to shout me down on that one. Woo, hankies are coming out, Jericho March happening. All this because I told you could throw your enemies in jail for 3 days. And so I'm struggling with that. What was the point of that? Joseph had remembered God's plan, but he knew that it would be a tough task for his father to leave his homeland. And he understood that if his father didn't leave his homeland, that the descendants wouldn't leave the homeland either. And so it would be a cycle that it would probably cause many of them to die. He had to get them to Egypt some way, somehow. So what did he use? He used fear as a motivation. Joseph could have gotten revenge at that moment. You know what he could have done? He could have sent them home with no food. He could have sent them home with no money. He could have robbed them. He could have taken them and said, no, I'm not giving you anything. He could have done something like selling them grain at a tremendous price and so not giving them enough grain for their family. But here's what he did. When he had the upper hand, he didn't choose to take revenge. He didn't take revenge at that moment. And that's the next thing I want you to see is you can't take revenge. Don't take revenge. When you have the upper hand, you want to get even. This person hurt me. This person caused this to me. And so here's what happened in verse 21. It says, speaking among themselves, they said, clearly we're being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Reuben asked. Now, remember a few weeks ago we said we all need Reubens in our life. Somebody's going to plead our cause. He said, but you wouldn't listen. Now he's saying, I told you so. And now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. Now he turned away from them and he began to weep. When he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. Then he chose Simeon from among them and had him tied up right before their eyes. And Joseph then ordered his servants to fill the men's stacks with grain. Now, when we have the upper hand, we want to take revenge. It reminds me of this exchange between a mother and her son. The mother runs into the bedroom when she hears her 7-year-old son just screaming, crying, and she finds her 2-year-old daughter pulling the hair of her 7-year-old son. So what does the mother do in that moment? She gently releases the little girl's grip and says, comfortingly to the boy, there, she didn't mean it. She doesn't know that hurts. He nodded his acknowledgement, and she left the room. As she started down the hall, the little girl began to scream, crying. Mom, what does she do? She rushes back in, and she says, what happened? And the little boy replied, she knows now. When we have the power, when we have the position, when we have the authority, We want to take revenge. We want to get even with those that hurt us. But Joseph didn't do that. He recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. He could have ignored them. He could have rejected their request for food. He could have spent the rest of his days living off Pharaoh's excess and gloating in the fact that they had come and they had bowed down to him and he won. But if he had done that, I doubt we would be speaking about the story today. He remembered that this was God's plan, and he chose not to get even. He chose not to take revenge on his brothers. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 says, "For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. Just as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned nor ever deceived anyone. He did, get this, verse 23, he did not retaliate when he was insulted." He didn't retaliate when he was insulted. I remember my grandfather telling me about turning the other cheek. He said, yeah, you need to turn the other cheek. And he said, but the Bible doesn't say what to do when you turn the other cheek. Okay, now he was being funny. But a lot of us, that's the way we want to respond when we've been hurt. We want to turn the other cheek, but we want to get even in the process. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. And he left, get this, he left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. So what do we do when we have all the power? What do we do when we have the upper hand? What do we do in that moment? When it is in your power, write this down this morning. Bless those who hurt you. Bless those who hurt you. Look at verse 25. Joseph then ordered his servants to fill the men's sack with grain, but he also gave secret instructions to return each brother's payment at the top of his sack, and he also gave them supplies for their journey home. So he not only gave them what they came and bought, he treated them fairly at that moment. They gave him the money, he gives them the grain, but he says, hey, you know what? Give them their money back. Put it in the top of each one of them's sack. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to make sure they have enough provisions for the trip home. I want you to give them a gift card to Buc-ee's. I want you to give them the gas in their car. I want you to make sure they're going to make it back okay. Now, some may say, oh, Pastor, I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to hurt anybody, but I sure ain't going to help them either. Friend, that's not the attitude of Christ. We're to bless those who persecute us. Look at Romans 12, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. It doesn't get any clearer than, right? But he goes on to say, don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Now, some of you pray like this. God, I pray that you would bless them with dysentery. I pray, God, that you would bless them with, No, that's not what he's talking about. That's not what he's talking about. Pray that the Lord will bless them. He said, be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Live, get this, live in harmony with each other. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Never pay back evil with more evil. Never. Have anybody ever gotten into like a prank war before? You know what I'm talking about? You prank somebody, and then they got to prank you, and then you got to prank them back because they pranked you, and then you prank them back because they pranked you. I was on vacation a couple of weeks ago. I had an inadvertent prank war started. I'm with my college buddies, and I was afraid I had just started a prank war because I was going to scare my friend, and I thought I'd just kind of scare him a little bit, and it'd be kind of funny. We're all college buddies, and we reverted back to junior high for just a few minutes there, and And I scared the living daylights out of him. I'm telling you, I've never seen a man scared so much. He ran out of the room screaming like a little girl. I mean, it was hilarious. But then I thought, he's going to pay me back. And he didn't. Like, I locked the door. And then I not only locked the door, the bedroom door that night, because I thought he'd come and get me in my sleep or something, but I locked the door, and then like I put a trash can in front of the door so that if he opened the door, he would come in. Why? Because when you start a prank war, even inadvertently, it always goes to another level. People don't ever get you back on the same level that you got them on, you know. So if you like you pour like one ice cube down the back, the next thing you know, you've got a whole 32-ounce big gulp on top of your head, and then the next thing you know, they're like wrapped in Saran wrap, and you know, got chocolate flowing down. I mean, it goes to another level every time because you're always trying to one up. Scripture says, don't retaliate with insults. Don't repay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you're honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. This is not the way we want to think when we have the upper hand. I want to get even. I want to make them pay for what they did to me. We want to get even with those that kicked us when we were down on the mat. Instead, we're never to pay back evil with more evil. We're to bless those who persecute us. In fact, 1 Peter said it like this: all of you should be of one mind. You know, in the body of Christ, that's what we're to be. One mind, one passion, one accord. We're all to be one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tenderhearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and He will grant you His blessing. So when somebody insults you, you want to say something back. Somebody says something about you, you want to, somebody comes in, and says, something about your mama or something, you want to say something about their mama. You know what I'm talking about? They say something about, well, you're bald. Well, that's okay. I'm all right with that. I've come to grips with it, and that, you want to come back and say, well, you're fat. You come back and and ugly, Now, I may be fat, but you're ugly, and I can lose weight. You're still going to be ugly when it's all said and done. You know what I'm talking about? You want to pay, your mama's so fat, and she can, no, never, sorry, I was raised on the playgrounds of the suburbs. It's tough living out there. Mama jokes flying back and forth, and I'm telling you, you want to do that, but that's not what God wants us to do. So what did Joseph do? He blessed his brothers. Obviously, they freaked out when they found the money. I can't imagine what they were going through here. This guy talked harshly to them. Simeon's in jail. All of this is, they came back, they tell their dad what happened. And Jacob, he said, look, you're not taking Benjamin away from me. Simeon's gone, Joseph's gone. I'm not sending Benjamin, but then the food runs out. And Judah goes to him and he convinces his dad, you got to let us take the boy back. The man there said he wanted to see all the brothers, and you've got to let us go back. Our whole nation, our whole clan is going to die. So when they arrived, Joseph invited the brothers to this meal, and to their surprise, he seats them in order by their age. And he also gave Benjamin, who was the only other son of his mother. So all the other brothers had like a different mom, but he and Benjamin were full brothers. Both of them had same mom, same dad. And so he gives Benjamin, to their surprise, 5 times the amount of food that he gave all the other brothers. So he loads them back up with food, and he sends them back on their way. But he has his servants put a silver cup in Benjamin's bag. Then he tells his servant, go after the one who has the silver cup in his bag. And so the brothers are like, listen, man, I don't, none of us have it. And whoever has it now that should be put to death and, all this kind of stuff. And they find it in Benjamin's bag. So they come running back. So why did he do that? Did he do that to get revenge? No, here's why he did it. I want you to understand this. As I was studying this week, it came alive in my heart and spirit. He did this to check to see if they had the same character and the same attitude that they had when they threw him in the pit. He wanted to see if they had change in their life. So what happened? Judah comes back and he says, please, let me stay. Throw me in jail. Let me be your slave. But please let my brother go back to be with his dad. He accepts responsibility when he could have at that moment thrown Benjamin under the bus. He could have gone back and said, Dad, Benjamin stole a cup and he's gone. I'm sorry. We did our best. But he didn't. Judah said, listen, let me take responsibility. He volunteered to be a slave so Benjamin could be set free. At this moment, Joseph has all the power. He has the upper hand. He could have gotten revenge. But all of this was set up to reveal who he really was. Joseph, at this moment of the big reveal, could have touted his power, could have touted his position, but when he finally revealed his identity, he did so in humility. So when we have the upper hand, we need to stay humble. Write that in your notes this morning. Look at chapter 45, verse 1. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers. When he told them who he was, then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please, come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. You know what Joseph never did here? He never referenced the dream. He never said, hey, you remember when I had those dreams and y'all got mad at me and you threw me down into the pit and then sold me into slavery? And you know what? It came true. Y'all came in. I saw your face, Simeon, when you bowed down for me. Yeah, look at me. I'm the greatest. I'm the king of the world. I brought my butterfly. I sting like a bee. I'm Joseph, man. He didn't do that. He never touted his position. He came in humility. He came in tears, and he revealed who he was. You know, when we have the upper hand, we have to respond in humility. Get this, I want you to get this morning. We only have the upper hand because God put us in that position. We only have that position of power or that position of authority because God placed us there. And Proverbs teaches us in 29, verse 23, pride ends in humiliation, while humility brings honor. So what do you have to do when you're walking through a tough time and you're going through just the tragedy and you're down on the mat and you're dealing with all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks? Maybe you feel like you've been in a pit yourself and you've been in a prison. You have to trust that God is working things for his good. Write that down in your notes. Look at verse 4 again. He said, please come closer. So they came closer. And he said again, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. Because it was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt. See, Joseph realized the reason he had the upper hand because it was part of God's plan. And God's plan was for the good of his people. when we're in a valley, when we're going through a difficult time, we need to trust that God is working things for his good. When we're on the mountaintop and everything is going great, we need to trust that God is working things for his good. When we're down on the mat and the referee is giving the count, we need to trust that God is working things for his good. And when we have the upper hand, and we can deliver a knockout punch to somebody else, we need to realize that God is working things for his good. Romans chapter 8 verse 28 says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Donald Stamps commented on the scripture like this. He said, concerning his faithful people, God will bring good out of all difficulties, troubles, persecution, and suffering. The highest good is that we will better relate to and become more like Jesus Christ, which will finally lead to sharing in his glory. See, God's purpose in Joseph's fight was for the good of his family and the good of the children of Israel. I mean, can you imagine? He has this dream. He's like, y'all bow down to me and everything. He didn't have the end game in mind. He didn't have the ending in mind at that moment. He didn't understand that the reason that they were coming to bow down to him is because they were dying. They were in desperate need of food. Their children were starving. And he was going to have the power in that moment to save them. But after he had walked in the pit, after he had walked into prison, he understood that God was at work when he saw the hand of God giving him the gift of administration to administrate at the prison, to administrate at Potiphar's house, and now at Pharaoh's palace. He understood that God had placed him for such a time as this, and that all things were working good for them that loved the Lord and called according to his purpose. He was preserving their nation through Joseph's slavery. God was preserving their nation through Joseph's imprisonment. God was preserving their nation through Joseph's prowess, and now his power. Joseph realized this throughout his entire life, even after his father had died, and he would have the opportunity to finally get his revenge. He chose not to. Look at Genesis chapter 50. Verse 14, after burying Jacob, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had accompanied him to his father's burial. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong we did to him, they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, please forgive your brothers for the great wrong they did to you, for the sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of the God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin. And when Joseph received this message, he had his guards go get him and hang him from the gallows. No, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we are your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. And he brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children. So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. He had in that moment the power in his hand. He no longer had to worry about what his dad would say. He no longer had to worry about what protection would be created by Jacob. He could have had him thrown in jail. He could have had him sent back. He could have cut off their food supply, but he didn't. He continued to bless them because he understood that God was working things for his good. Would you stand with me this morning?